It is generally considered poor form to murder one's brother, sleep with one's sister, and treat the Vatican treasury like a contactless debit card. But for Cesare Borgia, this was business as usual. Most historians know him as the inspiration for Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, a manual on ruthlessness that reads like a self-help book for sociopaths. But Cesare was not merely a politician. He was a man who looked at the Ten Commandments and saw them not as a moral framework, but as a bucket list to be ticked off in reverse order. He was born in Rome in September 1475, the illegitimate son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia and his mistress Vannozza dei Catani. Cesare was the eldest, followed by Giovanni, Geoffrey, and Lucrezia, a family unit that functioned less like a domestic arrangement and more like a syndicate of predatory wasps in velvet doublets. To ensure he was well-rounded, his father sent him to the University of Pisa to study law, though Cesare spent most of his time studying the anatomy of Spanish bulls. He was a skilled matador, famously beheading a bull with a single stroke of a sword, a grotesque display of hubris, unaware that the universe is a diligent bookkeeper, and was already calculating exactly how many spear thrusts it would take to balance the account. By the time he was a teenager, Cesare was described as the handsomest man in Italy, a compliment that likely had less to do with his bone structure and more to do with the fact that people who called him ugly tended to stop breathing shortly afterwards. In August 1492, Cesare's father decided it was time to buy the ultimate promotion. Following the death of Pope Innocent VIII, Rodrigo Borgia bribed his way into the papacy to become Pope Alexander VI. The conclave was less of a spiritual election and more of a high-end flea market, with Rodrigo literally sending mule loads of silver to the homes of rival cardinals to secure their votes. Cesare was aged 18, so naturally his father made him a cardinal, a role for which he was temperamentally unsuited on account of his total lack of piety, humility, or interest in anything that didn't involve artillery. Cesare loathed the church. He wanted to be a soldier, but that job was taken by his younger brother Giovanni, the captain general of the church. This sibling rivalry was resolved in typical Borgia fashion. On a dark night in June 1497, Giovanni disappeared after a dinner party. A woodcutter on the banks of the river Tiber later testified that he saw men dumping a body into the water. When the police asked why he hadn't reported it immediately, the woodcutter shrugged and replied that he saw 100 bodies thrown into the river every night and didn't think it was worth making a fuss about. Cesare, displaying the grief of a man who has just won the lottery, immediately asked for Giovanni's job. On the 17th of August 1498, he became the first person in history to resign the cardinalate, handing back the red hat as one might return a pair of trousers that were chafing the inner thigh. Now free of his vows, Cesare required a royal title, an army, and a wife who wouldn't ask too many questions. He travelled to France to court favour with King Louis XII, arriving with a retinue so lavish that his horses were shod in silver shoes designed to fall off, causing the peasants to scramble for the loose metal like pigeons fighting over a crust. He married Charlotte d'Albret, the sister of the King of Navarre. The marriage was transactional but effective. From this union, he produced his only legitimate child, a daughter named Louise Borgia. However, in true absentee father style, Cesare left France shortly after the wedding and never saw his wife or daughter again. He did, however, find time to father at least 11 illegitimate children across Italy, including a son named Girolamo and a daughter named Camilla, proving that while he was terrible at husbandry, he was excellent at reproduction. But for all his philandering, his most intense relationship remained with his sister, Lucrezia. Rumors had long whispered that their affection was biblical in the wrong sense of the word, and Cesare certainly didn't like sharing her. In July 1500, Lucrezia's husband, the handsome Alfonso of Aragon, was attacked by assassins but miraculously survived. While Alfonso was recovering in his bed, Cesare visited him to offer his sympathies. Moments after Cesare left the room, Alfonso was found strangled. Cesare implied that the boy had simply been clumsy and fallen neck first onto a pair of hands. Lucrezia cried for a week and then was promptly married off to the Duke of Ferrara. It seems that in the Borgia family, grief was just a scheduling conflict. But while his domestic life was chaotic, his face was collapsing. Cesare had contracted the French disease, syphilis. The pain was excruciating, so he began to wear a black velvet half mask at all times, giving him the appearance of a murderous theatre usher. Despite the rotting flesh, he marched 15,000 troops into the Romagna. He besieged the city of Forli, capturing its ruler, Caterina Sforza. Caterina was a formidable woman who had once stood on the ramparts and lifted her skirts to show the enemy she had the equipment to make more children. Cesare respected this, but he still threw her in a dungeon in the Castel Sant'Angelo, presumably because he didn't like being upstaged by a woman with more testosterone than him. By 1502, Cesare was effectively the CEO of Central Italy, a position he maintained through a management style that relied less on quarterly reviews and more on strangulation. He hired Leonardo da Vinci not to paint pretty pictures of smiling ladies, but to design military fortifications and automatic weapons, essentially asking the greatest genius of the Renaissance to act as his personal contractor for doom. While Leonardo sketched damp-proofing systems for stolen castles, Cesare busied himself with the Magione conspiracy. His mercenary captains, men with names like Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo, realized that their boss was a homicidal maniac who would likely kill them next, so they decided to rebel. Cesare's response was a masterclass in gaslighting. He offered them a truce, famously declaring that he wished to eat them like a dragon, a metaphor that should have rung alarm bells, but apparently didn't. He invited the rebels to a reconciliation dinner at Sinigalia on New Year's Eve, 1502. He greeted them with hugs and kisses, dismissed their troops, and then, before the appetizers had even arrived, had them arrested. That night, while Cesare chatted politely with their friends, he had Vitelli and Oliverotto strangled back to back with a viol string. Vitelli spent his final breath begging the Pope for a plenary indulgence, while Oliverotto spent his blaming the whole conspiracy on Vitelli, proving that there is no honor among thieves, especially when they are being asphyxiated. Machiavelli, who was there taking notes, called it a beautiful stratagem, which is high praise coming from a man who viewed morality as a tactical error. He was now the Duke of Romagna, feared by everyone from Florence to Naples. But reality was about to intervene, in the form of a waiter. In August 1503, Cesare and his father attended a banquet at the villa of Cardinal Cornetto. It was a humid Roman evening, and the Borgias had allegedly prepared a bottle of wine laced with cantarella, a slow-acting poison that tasted like sugar and worked like a demolition crew. However, in a twist worthy of a cheap farce, the butler reportedly confused the bottles. Cesare and the Pope both drank the poison intended for the host, as one does. Within days, the Pope was dead. The aftermath was a horror show that shocked even the cynical Romans. Pope Alexander VI's corpse decomposed with terrifying speed in the summer heat. Witnesses reported that the body turned black as a piece of cloth, the tongue swelled until it filled the mouth, and the body became so bloated that it was wider than it was long. When the undertakers arrived, the Pope did not fit in the coffin. Rather than build a new one, the guards removed their hats, placed them over their noses, and used their fists to punch the pontiff into the box, a final indignity for a man who had spent his life expanding his influence, only to expand physically at the worst possible moment. Cesare should have seized Rome, but the poison had left him an invalid. He lay shivering in bed, skin peeling, unable to stand, while the cardinals elected Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II. Julius was known as the warrior pope, and he hated the Borgias with the specific intensity of a man who has been waiting 10 years to settle a score. He arrested Cesare, demanded the return of all his castles, and locked him in the very same tower where Cesare had once imprisoned his enemies, proof that karma not only exists, but has a cruel sense of humor. Cesare, displaying the resilience of a cockroach in a nuclear winter, managed to escape to Naples, was arrested again, shipped to Spain, and imprisoned in the castle of La Motta. In 1506, he escaped again by filing through the bars and climbing down a silk rope. The rope was too short, forcing him to drop the final distance into the moat, shattering several bones. But he still managed to limp away to the court of his brother-in-law, King John of Navarre. He was now a commander without an army, a duke without a duchy, and a face without a nose, still wearing his leather mask to hide the ravages of syphilis. On the 12th of March 1507, during a minor skirmish at Viana, Cesare saw a group of enemy knights fleeing. Overcome by a sudden rush of blood to the head, or perhaps simply tired of the struggle, he charged after them, alone. He rode into a ravine, was ambushed by 3 soldiers who had no idea who he was, and was speared 25 times. The soldiers stripped him naked, leaving the man who had terrified Italy as nothing more than a piece of bloody meat in the mud, his modesty covered only by a red tile found on the ground. He was buried in the church of Santa Maria in Viana, under a grand marble tomb inscribed with the words, "Here lies in little earth one whom all the earth feared." However, even in death, the church had the final say. 200 years later, a bishop visited the church, was horrified that such a sinner was buried in holy ground, and had the bones dug up. He ordered them to be reburied under the street outside the church, so that every parishioner walking to Mass would literally trample on Cesare Borgia. He was a man who tried to become Caesar, but ended up as a piece of pavement. If you found this informative, and you enjoy cinematically animated true stories exploring history's more colourful characters and events, please like, share, and subscribe.